is actually working. I think from a public health perspective, though, there are two things that I want to mention, two of the many that I could, but that really stand out. And those were programs that invested in housing and food. We don't normally think about housing as connected to health, although people in Oregon, I think, have a better sense of this than many other states, given the great work that's happened in different parts of the state around connecting health and housing. And food is another interesting one. Like it seems like a no-brainer now to say what you eat impacts your health. Right? Most people would buy into that. But if you spent 4 years in a medical school, you would think that nutrition had nothing to do with health. In ways, because I certainly, I'll tell you what my nutrition education was in medical school. It was a class that was offered for 8 weeks. It was once a week. It was in the evenings, and it was optional. So guess how many people came to that class? There were 7 of us. One of them was the instructor. One of them was me. So there was like not many people. But despite that, food and housing are just really critical when it comes to impacting health. And what I was seeing was programs in Los Angeles and Portland and Chicago and in other cities, which were finding that when you invested in simply giving people a place to live, that their healthcare costs actually went down. And not down by like 1% or 2%. They went down by double-digit percentages. Humana has been doing some interesting work with some other organizations on trying to take people who are struggling with food insecurity and give them access to healthy foods. And they're finding, at least one stage of work that they did, they were finding they were reducing the healthcare costs at an average $15 per month per person who was involved in that program. You can make a big difference with small investments in housing and in food. And I was finding those to be really exciting, interesting, promising examples, but examples that force us to think more broadly about health than we normally do, to recognize that health is so much more than what happens in hospitals and clinics. And in fact, the boundaries of health have to be extended to our entire community, because as I quickly came to see when I was practicing medicine, I can make a difference in the lives of people. It was a small difference relative to how much of a difference their community made. I could easily, for example, tell a patient, why don't you go for a walk after dinner? It'll be a great way to get some exercise and to perhaps work toward your goal of losing weight. But if they lived in a neighborhood that was not safe, where going for a walk after dinner put you at risk of getting mugged or being shot, they probably weren't going to do that. And so the safety of neighborhoods matters. Whether or not people have housing matters, their availability of healthy and affordable foods actually matter. The environment in schools, and whether those environments support the emotional development of our children, or whether they subject them to violence and bullying, that matters in the long-term health of our children. And I came to see that as a doctor, if I was not somehow aware of that and involved with my community in that larger process of creating and strengthening the foundations for good health, and I would spend the rest of my career in clinics trying to deal with the downstream consequences, of not preventing so many of the things that we knew we could prevent. And that felt like a very difficult prospect. So that was what got me excited, frankly, about doing public health. It's what's made me excited about seeing some of these initiatives that are focused on housing and food, because they are helping to really change how we think about health and make us recognize that health in all fields, whether it's transportation or education, has a profound impact on the health of adults and children.
I feel the need to say that Lane County Public Health is hiring, if you're interested. So thank you for that response, and I think it's a pretty good segue. The housing, the homelessness issue, the food issue. 2 years ago, San Diego had a pretty large hepatitis A outbreak. They were just shy of 600 cases. Many in this room know about it. We studied it at home hard here, because we're on the I-5 Interstate 5 corridor, and many of these people were houseless. And we have a pretty transient migrant population that kind of comes up and down and looking for services, and some in Lane County. And it's not uncommon for me to go to one of our tent camps or homeless camp, and 20-30% are from California, which is kind of a surprise. At any rate, we kind of thought that was Armageddon. Hepatitis A outbreaks, that's not something you typically see in this country. For my 30 years of medicine, I've seen very few. In my Navy time, I saw some overseas when I was stationed overseas, but not here. So we thought that was Armageddon. Really, it was kind of pre-Armageddon. 2 weeks ago, the state of Kentucky passed 4,000 cases of hepatitis A in the last 12 months. It's a vaccine-preventable disease. It's a pretty good vaccine. We wish all vaccines were as good as the measles vaccine, the Hep A vaccine, but some of them are not. And it's a challenge. So we have several states now with a few thousand cases. We're concerned, how do we as a community, and how do we as perhaps community-based public health prepare for things like this? It seems to show us that we have some fraying infrastructure. And how can we best prevent these sort of outbreaks?
Yeah, I mean, what a timely question, right? Given the measles outbreak that we're seeing. Just in one state north of here, I know there have been cases here in Oregon. When I actually started my time as Surgeon General, it was actually in the middle of the 2014 measles outbreak that had started in Southern California and spread to many other states. I mean, to me, these are great tragedies when we have the tools to prevent illness and when we're unable to deploy them for whatever the reason might be. I'm sure that there, as all of us have read about in the papers, we have some real challenges with vaccinating with our kids in this country, and it's vaccinating not just for measles, but more broadly for other illnesses too. And I had a discussion on vaccines. The discussion on vaccines has infrastructure, they're proven to work, and the science is very good, and to be clear, behind vaccines. Being very effective at preventing illness and being, by and large, one of the safest methodologies that we have for medical interventions. Now, just keep in mind what I said one of the safest methodologies. I didn't say that they're 100%, like there's never been a complication with the vaccine. I mean, for God's sakes, there are complications with Tylenol, right? Like there's something you find, like everything that you take has the potential of having some side effect. And the question is always, how big of a side effect is it? How common of a side effect is it? And it turns out with most vaccines, particularly like the measles vaccine, that the frequency of complications is very, very low, and the severity of complications tends to be lower as well. But that said, there's been a tendency, I think, sometimes by folks who want all of our kids vaccinated to look at people who are not supportive of vaccines and to call them anti-vaxxers, to use terms which could be pejorative, to not recognize that a lot of times these are folks who want to do right by their kids too. They want to take care of their children. They may have a difference in terms of approach or philosophy on something, but this is, I think, really important in general, not just with measles, but with all debates. Like, I think we've had a hard time sometimes as a country separating the person from the argument, and sometimes saying that, okay, if someone disagrees with us, that they've got to be dumb, they've got to be a bad person, they've got to be evil in some way, and this is not the way for us to foster good dialogue. But I think, look, the challenge, I think, with vaccines is in part, especially with measles, is how we frame them. Like, there are certain things which I think one should be able to do entirely based on your own volition, right? So I think whether or not I choose to drink 6 cups of water a day or 8 cups of water a day should be up to me. I don't necessarily want somebody mandating to me that I drink 8 cups of water, There are certain things like that I think that should be left up to us. But in society, like, we made certain decisions that the particular decisions fall into another category where, even though it's sort of up to us to do them, that there should be other mechanisms to push us in that direction. One example is how fast we drive on the highway, right? So, if I'm a pure personal freedom, advocate, I would say nobody should restrict me in terms of how fast I can go on the highway. I should be able to go as fast as I want. But the reason we have laws in place is because how fast I drive impacts you, and impacts you, because you might be on the road at the same time, and I could put you at risk. And that is the challenging and sticky space we find ourselves in with vaccines, right? Is that whether or not one vaccinates their child actually has an impact potentially on other children. I have a daughter who just turned 1 about a month ago. And when she turned 1, I was relieved for many reasons, but for one reason in particular, because she could actually get her measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. But children before the age of 1 cannot get that vaccine, right? And so they are susceptible to measles outbreak, and that would have been really concerning and frightening for me and my wife. With our child at risk. Some people on the road whose children, people also who just don't respond to vaccines. They'll get vaccinated multiple times, but their body won't raise an antibody response. And so even though they've been vaccinated, they're still not protected. And all of these groups of people, my daughter before she turned 1, all of the types of people I mentioned to you, they depend on folks around them being, at least keep that illness out of the population. And that's why I think vaccines become a little bit tricky. Is because they're not sort of purely an individual decision because they affect other people, but they're really sensitive because people are genuinely worried about what might happen to their children. In the case of measles, some of you may have seen the news about a very large study that just came out a couple of weeks ago, in fact, just a few days ago, that was actually done in Europe, and it was a study done with over 600,000 children. And you don't normally see studies that big done in clinical medicine, but it was done because researchers felt, even though there's been a lot of data on this, the efficacy and safety of this measles vaccine, people are still concerned, so maybe some more, so maybe we should repeat those studies, just to make sure that everybody's at a much bigger level, just to make sure we haven't missed something. And so that's what they did. And the data was that not only is there not an association between that vaccine and measles and autism, which was an issue of concern for some people, but there was also clear that even in children who may be susceptible to autism, but it did not accelerate like their likelihood of developing autism. What came out is that kids who receive that vaccine and don't receive the vaccine don't seem to develop autism at different rates. And that was important to have even more data there. But look, I think that the bottom line is that we want to build the right infrastructure to prevent not just measles outbreaks, but Hep A outbreaks or other outbreaks where there is a vaccine to help prevent them. And we have to really work with communities to understand what's at the root of their concerns, and we have to engage trusted voices to get facts out. Because the problem is that unlike 30 years ago where most people got their facts from like 3 TV stations and a couple of newspapers and their close circle of friends, I mean, people are getting facts from all over the place. Everyone is an expert now, and I just need a Facebook page and a Twitter account, and I can be the world's expert on anything. And that's really actually quite dangerous in a world where it's so easy to spread misinformation. And so I don't think, though, the way we're going to do this is by trotting out celebrities to talk about the issue, right? That can help a little bit, in getting attention to an issue, but I don't think that really changes hearts and minds on an issue. I think what changes people's hearts and minds is when they hear from people they trust, and when they hear the stories of people in their communities that they love. That's when they start opening up, and that's when they start listening. They may not change their mind entirely, but I think our best shot of having a real conversation, best to protect our children, in particular, from vaccine-preventable illness, is to actually engage our faith organizations, our public health leaders, doctors and nurses in communities, our teachers in schools. It's to engage them in conversations with parents as well, to understand, what do we know? How can we best protect our children? What can we learn from communities around us? And then how can we move forward? That's, I think, how we ultimately move people. That's how we, I think, change hearts and minds. That's, I think, a lot of what we need to do when it comes to helping people understand what vaccines can do and what they can't do when it comes to improving our health. Because the last thing to understand this is that this kind of conversation and dialogue about things like vaccines is really important, but it's tough to make happen. You can't pass some law in DC that's going to make people have these conversations, like in communities. Like, the impetus for it has to really come locally. It has to be driven by parents and teachers and doctors and nurses, for example. And it can't always, come from the outside. And so I just offer that just to say that this is not an issue where I think solutions will magically fall upon a community, but these are the hard conversations that communities have to have together. And if you can have it about something like the measles vaccine, then those communities can start to have conversations like that about how to make opioid use disorder treatment more accessible. We can start to have conversations about how to ensure that our kids actually have access to healthy food in school, so they have, the fuel they need for a healthy start in life. We can start to talk about a whole range of issues, but in town after town and city after city in America, our mechanism for dialogue and for listening to each other has been broken. It's been fractured, but it's not irreparable. It's something that we can rebuild again. And I think that stands as the greatest public health challenge of our time, is how to figure out how to create that kind of dialogue so we can finally fight the diseases of today and tomorrow together and not standing
alone. In doing some research, speaking of being online, I learned that you are a mango aficionado, and I have 3 children. They routinely tell me, Dad, you're behind the times. and I was thinking, mango, tango, salsa, maybe it's something you eat, it's not a fruit. So, what is a mango aficionado? Pay well, and tell us about.
Okay, so I love mangoes, and I grew up with mangoes. My parents were originally from India, and one of the things that they sought to do when they moved to the United States, and they moved here from Newfoundland actually, so to Miami from Newfoundland, so it was like incredibly cold, incredibly warm. But one of the things that they set up doing right away was they embarked on this effort to recreate India in the backyard. And what that meant was all the fruits and vegetables that they grew up with, they planted them. So we grew up with coconut trees in our backyard, with banana plants. We grew up with mango trees and jackfruit trees and starfruit trees and custard apples and all of these things growing in our backyard with a variety of jasmine flowers, which they grew, in their homes in India. If we could have had rice paddy fields in our backyard, my dad would have put them in, but we just didn't have enough space or water. So anyhow, that's what they did, and we had 10 varieties of mango trees actually, like when I was growing up, and there are many more varieties than that. And in part, I know this because in Miami there's an international mango festival that happens every year, where they bring literally hundreds of varieties of mangoes for people to taste and to do something with. Now, we didn't need to go to that festival to learn that there's a lot you can do with mangoes, because even growing up, my mother would make mango pudding, mango milkshakes, mango bread, mango curry, you name it, like they always happen, mango jam, all kinds of stuff going on. So that's how I learned so much about mangoes. It doesn't pay at all, but in terms of money, but in terms of satisfaction, it's incredible. So even today when my parents come to visit during mango season, they will bring a suitcase full of mangoes. My mother's record is 72 mangoes in a suitcase.
Awesome. That's
And they all
awesome.
get consumed.
Well, you are old hat at this, and after a softball question, you hit hard. So you know what's coming, right? Okay.
I'm ready.
All right. So just a few weeks before you took office, you published a report on skin cancer, and there were a variety of pieces of data that I think were less than public health. There have been countries across the planet who've been looking at melanoma rates going up. Australia in particular has some terrible data that they're very concerned. And our country is seeing increases of lung cancer. I think you dealt with my American Journal of Preventive Medicine is one of my favorite journals because I'm a Prev Med doc, and the Surgeon General should say that indoor ultraviolet radiation causes skin cancer. So this caught my eye in 2015, again just a few weeks after you took office, and it got me thinking for this presentation, how first of all do Surgeon General recommendations, Surgeon General warnings, how does it happen? And then what kind of headwinds and tailwinds and challenges do you face? And I can imagine the tanning industry would not be very happy with you saying it causes cancer, but give us a sense of those pieces of your job.
Question, and this is actually where there's a lot of politics involved here, as you would imagine, right? Because, and the job, part of the reason that I took the job as Surgeon General was not because I had been planning for that my whole life, or because I dreamed about that. I respected the position, but I never thought actually I would ever work in government. But one of the things that appealed to me about the job is that it was an independent job, and it was one that required putting the needs of the public above everything else. It's an unusual role because it's a role that's appointed by the president, and most roles that are appointed by the president are your job is to execute the agenda of the president. But it was actually different in the case of the Surgeon General. Even though you're appointed by the president, your duty is to execute on what the public needs and based on what science dictates, even if it conflicts with your president, right? And I was asked that question when I was meeting with senators, like, what would you do if you and the president have a different view on a subject? Like, would you back down? And I said I would have a conversation with the president, about that. We would try to come to common ground, but I would not change what I say about an issue because the president disagreed with it if the science was very clear, on what that issue was. And that's what the job was. That's what I was excited about. Inevitably, when you come to office, though, there are people who have issues that they want you to talk about and people who don't want you to talk about certain issues, right? And so I would receive letters from members of the public, from members of Congress, from governors, from mayors, from people all over the country, even from people actually outside the country who, like, there's many countries that I realized read and consume our Surgeon General reports and rely on them. One of the first international meetings I went to, I met with some I won't say which country it was, but I met with the leadership of one of our sort of major partners in the world. And one of the first agenda items they had is the list of Surgeon General reports that they were hoping I could publish. It was really striking. So people will come with requests all the time. And then there are folks who have to deal with the politics, who will try to weigh what should or should not be talked about, how much oxygen or air should it get, etc. I'll give you an example of where this came about. In 2016, as you mentioned, I published the first Surgeon General's report on alcohol, drugs, and health. It was a report about substance use and addiction. So think about the words I just used: alcohol, drugs, and health. Right? The word alcohol is there. It's actually first in the things that we're describing. And so you would be right to think that there was some concern, from folks in the industry, alcohol industry, as to why is it that we're lumping alcohol into this report? Like, are we trying to draw attention to it? Are we going to be pushing for policies that will restrict alcohol sales and may impact profitability, that might people think that, no one should be drinking alcohol? There are all of these concerns that were starting to bubble up. And it was sort of to me by some people, that, gosh, this would be an easier report to do if we just didn't deal with alcohol, right? That's clearly not the right thing to do, though, right? And so, yes, it came at some, bit of a political cost, but my decision was, no, it has to be in there. We know that it costs more in terms of lives and dollars than many of the other issues that we're talking about in the paper. So not only should it be there, but it should be prominent. We should be leading with that. And that's what we did. But there's inevitably some blowback from that. Another example where this came up was with e-cigarettes. When I actually published our first report on e-cigarettes, there were calls from all over the country for the president to fire me. We're all over the place, right? Different people. And this report, to be clear, was on e-cigarettes and youth. So it was not, it recognized very clearly that at that time, we did not have enough data to say whether e-cigarettes could help people who are already smoking quit. We said it's possible they might, and very likely they're less harmful than regular cigarettes, but we don't 100% know if they're going to be effective in helping people quit. But that's an open question. Let's put that over here. And instead, let's look at the question of what we do know and we have good data on, which is that e-cigarettes are actually not good for our kids. And that nicotine, which most e-cigarettes contain, is highly addictive. And when children get addicted to nicotine, it increases their likelihood of addiction to other substances. It increases the likelihood that if they're using e-cigarettes, that they're going to transition to regular cigarettes, and that data has actually been borne out even more so today. So we built this report on very solid scientific grounding, saying that our kids should not be using e-cigarettes. That probably wouldn't seem to most of you to be a terribly controversial statement, but there were some people who felt very strongly that anything that is said that is not supportive of e-cigarettes is ultimately going to harm the cause of bringing e-cigarettes to folks who smoke. And even if I'm talking about kids, then it doesn't matter. And so there's a lot of pressure that we got from folks in the communities to sort of shut up about the issue, to not put out this report. But again, it was the right thing to do, and even though there were petitions, to fire me, at the end of the day, my view on this issue was I wasn't in office because I was trying to pave the way for like a Senate run or run for president or something like that. Like, I was here in a very unexpected way to serve in government, to do the best I could, and then I'd probably leave after that. So if people got pissed and asked for me to be fired, then it's okay. I'm going to be gone probably soon enough. But I wanted to make sure, not just for the sake of my tenure, I wanted to make sure that we weren't just doing the right thing when I was there. But if you don't do the right thing, if you start to let politics influence your decision making on what issues you take on and what you choose to speak about, then you tarnish also the reputation of the office, which impacts the ability of future surgeons general to do their job. I guess the last issue I should mention that this came up on was around gun violence, right? So one of the issues that had come up when I was going through my confirmation process was the issue of gun violence, what my views on it, things like that. And I was sort of very clear in saying that I thought that gun violence was a serious public health issue. That apparently became a seriously controversial statement, although I don't know why it was a controversial statement. I know politically why, but logically, whenever you have large numbers of people who are dying for preventable reasons, that constitutes a public health crisis. And the gun violence falls squarely into that category. But that was one of those circumstances where I was often asked by people to stop talking about it and to actually not say things about it. And you might, it sounds like, votes on gun violence have been very partisan, in recent years. But I would have both Republicans and Democrats who would sometimes tell me, hey, please don't talk about this, we don't want to have to deal with this, we're up for re-election and this, that, et cetera. And so, I had to make decisions there about like, what do I do? So when I mentioned earlier what like tools I think one needs to navigate the job as Surgeon General well, I think one of them is really around navigating relationships, right? Because you have to be able to disagree with people and sometimes say and do things in the public square that they do not want you to do and have told you not to do, without them feeling like you are out to get them, or that you hate them personally, or that you're undermining them in some way. And sometimes that's impossible to do, but it requires a lot of navigation. And so, yeah, it was a challenging experience, but I always told my team that we know who our boss is, and our boss is the public, even before the president, even before anyone else, that the needs of the public come first, and we should stand on those needs, and we should stand on the tenets of science. And if that means that we go down early, that we leave office early, then we leave knowing that we did what was right. That's what we use to kind of guide what we said, what issues we published, what we spoke out about. And yeah, and I look back on that and I feel good, and even though, I perhaps could have served longer, had I viewed, like the political lines, to me that's, you don't sacrifice principle, for longevity. That's not a trade-off that ever is worthwhile in the long run. And I'm glad that we at least do our best of our ability, stuck by that, when I was there.
Larry?
So we're about at the halfway point. Are you okay with transitioning to questions from the audience? Why don't we do that? So, again, as Jocelyn mentioned, there are 3 microphones here, 2 on each side and 1 in the middle. And we will hew to the City Club rules, so please have a question and make it clear and concise. And please limit your comments. We want to make sure that everyone who wants to ask a question is able to do so. So if you'd like to ask a question, please come up to the mic.
You can just tell me your name and who you are as well, that'd be great.
My name is Dr. Michi Okuda, trained as a biologist and entomologist. Also work in healthcare as a licensed massage therapist and body worker with energy fields. And this is a health crisis coming here already, I don't know. Something that I was alerted to when I started seeing or hearing about 5G cell antenna going into our city recently. So, as a former researcher, I dug in, okay, and there it was. Very frightening to me. So this is what I found. I understand that 5G cell phone technology currently being introduced into cities in this country uses radio frequency, microwave, and millimeter wave technology in the 6 to 100 billion hertz range. This is what scientists are saying. I don't think they know for sure because it hasn't been rolled out and it's quite confidential information in the industry. In Eugene, the cell antennae are being placed at this time every 500 feet in residential areas, in downtown sections, commercial areas. In other cities, every 2 to 8 houses. So I understand that the millimeter wave technology, which doesn't go very far, and that's why they have to place the cell antennas so frequently or, short distances between them. The millimeter wave is developed by the military and used for crowd control that makes people literally feel like they're on fire. They keep up their skin to the point where they're burning. Only the second or 2 of exposure is in the 95 gigahertz range.